boy falls from a cliff, returns with a shocking message for his dad. The sky was still and heavy with the kind of silence only found in remote places, where the wind barely stirred the trees and time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. The air was thick with the scent of pine, mingled with the earthy undertones of moss and wet stone. It was the kind of day that made you feel like you were the only one left on Earth. The father, Thomas, trudged through the dense underbrush, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. His breath came in labored gasps, his pace slow and deliberate, as if the weight of the world rested squarely on his shoulders. Beside him, his son, Jason, was a blur of energy. The 10-year-old had always been a wild thing, the kind of boy who thrived in the outdoors, always running ahead, always looking for something to climb, something to explore. It was a quality that Thomas had once admired in his son, that insatiable curiosity, but today, it made his heart race with anxiety. "Slow down, kid," Thomas called out, his voice hoarse from the morning hike. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the rocky terrain ahead. They had been hiking for hours, the summit just within reach. Jason, however, was already several paces ahead, darting between trees, moving with the confidence of a boy who had no fear. Thomas called after him again, his voice rising. "Jason, stay where I can see you." But the boy didn't listen. He never did. Thomas sighed, the familiar frustration bubbling to the surface. He hated the way Jason never seemed to listen, always pushing boundaries, testing limits. It was in his nature, his stubbornness, his need to explore the world beyond the confines of what Thomas thought was safe. But today, it felt different. Today, every bone in Thomas's body told him to be cautious, to keep a closer eye on Jason, but he ignored it, pushing the nagging feeling away as just another irrational fear of a father too protective for his own good. The path ahead grew steeper, the incline forcing Thomas to slow his pace. His legs burned from the effort, and his breath became shallow. He glanced up, scanning the rocky cliffs that bordered the trail. The mountain was breathtaking but dangerous. His eyes followed the jagged edges of the rocks as they rose sharply into the sky. A beautiful, unforgiving place. Then a shout. "Dad, look!" Thomas froze. Jason had appeared at the top of a rocky ledge, his body half crouched, peering over the edge with a grin plastered across his face. "Jason, get back!" Thomas yelled, a surge of panic ripping through him. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched his son lean even further over the precipice, his small hands gripping the sharp rocks. "I can see the whole valley from here. It's amazing!" Jason's voice echoed back to him, carried by the thin mountain air. "Jason!" Thomas's voice cracked as he sprinted toward the ledge, but he was too late. In one horrifying moment, Thomas watched his son lose his balance. Jason's feet slipped, and his body tumbled backward as the rocks gave way beneath him. Time seemed to freeze for a second, the world slowing to a crawl. Thomas's heart seemed to stop in his chest, his mind unable to process the image of his son falling. "Jason!" he screamed, his voice a raw, desperate shout. He lunged forward, reaching out, but his hands grasped only air. Then the silence returned. It was an oppressive, suffocating silence that settled over Thomas, paralyzing him. He stood frozen on the trail, his eyes locked on the spot where Jason had fallen. The world around him spun, the sound of his own breathing too loud in his ears. His heart hammered in his chest, but his legs wouldn't move. He couldn't move. All he could do was stand there, staring at the edge of the cliff, waiting for something to change, waiting for a miracle that he knew would never come. The minutes stretched into eternity as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He could feel his body shaking, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him, but still, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the place where his son had fallen. Finally, he forced himself into motion. His body moved on autopilot, pushing through the pain, the horror. He scrambled up the jagged rocks, his hands slipping on the cold stone, his mind screaming at him to hurry, to reach his son. But as he reached the top, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no sign of Jason. Just the empty, vast expanse of the valley below, stretching out in all directions. Thomas collapsed to his knees, his hands gripping the rocks as his breath came in ragged gasps. His heart sank and a cold, empty sensation settled in his chest. There was no sign of Jason. Nothing. Just the echo of his screams fading into the distance. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. But the mountain gave no answer. The search lasted for days, but no one seemed to know where Jason had gone. The weather had turned cold, the winds picking up as if nature itself was holding its breath. Search teams were deployed, some from the local area, others from a nearby town, their faces grim as they combed the rocky landscape, looking for any sign of the boy. But despite their best efforts, the rugged terrain proved to be an insurmountable challenge. The steep cliffs, the unforgiving rocks, and the dense trees made it nearly impossible to find anything in the vast expanse of wilderness. Thomas couldn't sit still. Every day, he was there with the volunteers, pushing through the underbrush, calling his son's name over and over, hoping for some sign that Jason had survived. But nothing came. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the rustling of the trees, the distant calls of birds, and the occasional crackle of branches underfoot. Every time the search parties returned empty-handed, it felt like another piece of his soul was ripped away. The first night after Jason fell, Thomas hadn't slept at all. He'd spent the entire night pacing in the small cabin they had rented, trying to convince himself that Jason was just lost, that he was somewhere out there, hurt but alive. He kept telling himself that he would find him. But as the days passed, that hope began to fade, and the harsh reality set in. Jason wasn't coming back. The next few days were a blur. Thomas had become a shell of the man he once was. His body moved through the motions, eating, talking, looking for his son, but his mind was far away, stuck in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He refused to leave the search efforts. If anyone would find Jason, it would be him. He had to be the one to bring his son back, no matter the cost. But the others, the ones in charge of the search, were beginning to lose hope. It was a delicate thing to say, but one of the volunteers had pulled Thomas aside that second day, his expression kind but firm. "You have to understand, Tom. The chances of finding him alive after this long..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Thomas had stared at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and rage. He could feel his chest tightening, a pressure building that felt like it would swallow him whole. He wanted to scream at the man, to tell him he was wrong, that they couldn't stop looking for Jason, that they had to keep searching. But instead, all he could do was nod and turn away, a lump forming in his throat. The days dragged on. Every morning, the search continued, but with each passing hour, the number of people who believed Jason was still alive diminished. There were whispers of calling it off. The boy had fallen too far, and no one expected him to survive the drop. But Thomas couldn't let that thought enter his mind. He refused to believe it. On the third night, when the search teams had finally returned to the cabin, defeated and covered in dirt, Thomas stood alone on the edge of the cliff. The wind whipped through his hair, biting at his skin as he gazed down at the chasm below. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought of Jason, of his son's bright eyes and infectious smile. Was he still out there somewhere? The question haunted him, gnawed at him from the inside out. But no answer came. Just the howling wind and the endless, unyielding sky. He returned to the cabin that night, but his mind couldn't find rest. The weight of guilt crushed him. It was his fault. He should have been more careful. He should have kept a tighter grip on Jason, should have yelled at him sooner, stopped him from getting too close to the edge. But instead, he had let him wander off, let him make his own decisions. Now, his son was gone, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. The following morning, the sky was gray, a heavy mist hanging over the mountains. The clouds seemed to hang low, pressing down on everything. The search teams, tired but determined, headed out once more, but this time, there was a palpable sense of finality. They had already searched the nearby woods, the cliffs, and the valley below. There was nothing more to be done. Thomas, still unable to accept the reality, insisted on staying behind. He told the others to continue, to push farther. He would keep looking, even if it meant he was alone out there. Even if it meant walking the same ground over and over again, until his legs gave out from exhaustion. But the isolation wore on him. The stillness of the mountains, the endless quiet, it all pressed in on him, amplifying the pain. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. Every corner he turned, every tree he passed, felt like a reminder of what he had lost. The absence of Jason was suffocating. By the 5th day, Thomas could no longer deny what everyone else had already accepted. Jason wasn't coming back. The last search team returned empty-handed, and the decision was made. The official report was that Jason had fallen and didn't survive the fall. It was a tragic accident, the kind that happened in remote places like this, where the terrain was treacherous and the cliffs unforgiving. But for Thomas, the report was just a formality. He refused to accept it. There had to be something else. There had to be another explanation. He couldn't let go of the idea that Jason was still out there, somewhere. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Thomas stood by the cabin's window, staring out at the wilderness. His thoughts swirled in chaos. Was it possible Jason was still alive? The thought didn't seem rational, but it consumed him, driving him further into obsession. Jason, he whispered into the cold night air, his voice barely audible. Where are you? And that was the question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Where was his son? What had happened to him? And why couldn't Thomas shake the feeling that Jason wasn't gone? He was just somewhere he couldn't reach. The days continued to stretch on like a slow, suffocating crawl. Thomas found himself stuck in an endless loop of denial and regret. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on him with each passing hour. He could feel the weight of the mountain, the pressure of the vast, empty space around him, pressing against his chest. There was no escaping it, no relief from the crushing grief. By the end of the first week, the town had begun to move on. The search had officially ended, the volunteers had gone home, and life began to return to its regular rhythm. But not for Thomas. He couldn't let go. Every conversation he had with the locals was filled with polite sympathy, but no one seemed to understand. Everyone else had accepted it as a tragic accident, but for Thomas, there was still the lingering question. Where was Jason? The people in town started talking. They had already started to say things behind his back, rumors that swirled like an invisible storm. Some people said Thomas wasn't accepting the truth, that he was just holding on to false hope, clinging to a memory that was slipping away. Others whispered about the possibility that Jason had never fallen at all, that perhaps he had run off, gone into the woods of his own accord. But Thomas couldn't bring himself to consider that. His son wasn't the kind of boy who would just run off. He was smart, adventurous, yes, but not reckless. And no matter how many times he tried to convince himself otherwise, Thomas knew deep down that something was wrong. Something wasn't right. He spent most of his time walking the trails around the cabin. It was as though if he could just find the right spot, if he could walk just a little farther into the forest, maybe he'd find a clue that everyone else had missed. He'd find Jason. Every crackling twig, every rustling leaf sounded like his son's voice calling out to him. But there was never anything. The silence was unbearable. The cabin became a prison. Each room was a reminder of what he had lost, each corner a place where memories of Jason lingered. The photographs on the walls, the toys scattered across the floor, everything reminded him that his son was gone. But there was no closure. There was no peace. One evening, as Thomas sat by the fire in the cabin, staring blankly into the flames, the door creaked open. His heart leapt in his chest, and for a moment he thought it might be Jason, finally coming back. He rushed to the door, but it was only a figure standing in the doorway. It was Mark, a friend of Thomas's from the local police force. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a sorrowful pity. "Thomas," Mark said quietly, stepping inside. I think we need to talk." Thomas stared at him, his stomach dropping. He had heard that tone before, the one that preceded bad news. "What is it?" Thomas's voice was hoarse. He didn't want to hear it, but he knew it was coming. "Look, I don't want to make this harder on you than it already is," Mark began, his hands shifting nervously at his sides. "But there's been talk about what happened that day. Some of the townsfolk are asking questions. They want answers." Thomas clenched his fists, the anger rising in him like a slow burn. "What kind of questions?" he spat. "I've told you everything. I've told everyone what happened. My son fell. He's gone. End of story." Mark hesitated, his eyes flickering to the floor. "It's not that simple, Thomas. People are wondering if maybe Jason ran off. Some of them think you're just not accepting the truth. They think you're trying to make it something more than it was. Thomas felt the room spin. His heart raced in his chest as the anger welled up inside him. "That's absurd," he yelled, his voice raw and desperate. "My son didn't run off. He fell. He's gone, and I'm the one who has to live with that, not them. What do they want me to say? That I made it up?" Mark looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. "I'm not saying it's true, Tom. But I think you need to talk to someone. A professional. Maybe get some closure. You've been out here too long on your own, just waiting for something to change." Thomas's fists tightened even more. He couldn't do it. He couldn't accept that. He wasn't ready to face the idea that Jason was really gone. The thought of it made his entire body ache with a pain so deep he couldn't describe it. "I don't need closure," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I need my son back." Mark said nothing for a long moment, then finally nodded. "I understand, Tom. I don't want to see you spiral into something darker. This town isn't going to let it go. They'll keep asking questions and they won't stop. Not unless you do something." The words hung in the air between them. Mark wasn't just talking about the town's curiosity. He was talking about Thomas's own state of mind. The longer he stayed here, the more it seemed like the world was closing in on him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. Mark gave him a final, sympathetic glance before leaving. "I'll check in tomorrow," he said quietly before shutting the door behind him. Thomas stood there, staring at the empty space where his friend had been. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth didn't reach him. There was no comfort here, no relief. His mind was racing, trying to hold on to any shred of hope that Jason was still out there. But deep down, he knew that it was slipping away bit by bit. The next morning, as Thomas walked the familiar trail near the cliff's edge, a thought began to form in his mind. He couldn't stop the search. He couldn't let go. Jason wasn't dead. Not yet. He would find his son. He had to. The wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver down his spine as the fog rolled in from the valley below. It was the kind of morning that made the world seem empty, a place where everything seemed lost. But Thomas was determined. He would find Jason. He had to. But as the days passed and the town began to forget about him, something inside Thomas began to change. He became more erratic, more obsessed. The town's whispers no longer seemed like the soft hum of idle chatter. They were accusations. They were voices telling him that he was a failure, that he was to blame for Jason's disappearance. He couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. And he wasn't going to stop until he got them. It was late afternoon when Thomas first saw him. The silhouette in the distance, stumbling through the thickening mist, barely more than a shadow against the trees. For a moment, Thomas's heart stopped. He thought it was a trick of the light, his mind playing cruel games on him. He had been walking the same stretch of forest for hours, his boots crunching on the wet leaves, his thoughts consumed by the weight of the last few days, when he first spotted the figure. "Jason?" The word escaped his lips in a rasping whisper before he could stop himself. His heart leaped in his chest, the shock of seeing someone, so familiar, yet so impossibly out of place, sent a wave of panic through him. The figure moved slowly, dragging its feet, as if exhausted or disoriented. At first, Thomas couldn't tell if it was really Jason or if his mind had finally cracked under the pressure. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the boy had fallen. What was this? A hallucination? A trick of grief? But as the figure got closer, the unmistakable shape of a child became clear. A boy, small and thin, moving slowly, his body hunched, stumbling through the underbrush. "Jason?" Thomas's voice cracked this time, his entire body trembling as he stumbled forward. The boy didn't respond. He didn't even seem to acknowledge Thomas's presence. There was no recognition in his eyes, no sign that he knew who he was. His clothes were torn, covered in dirt and leaves, and his face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant, like someone who had been lost for a long time. But Thomas didn't care about the signs. He reached out for him, his hands trembling. The boy's eyes flicked up, and for a moment, they met Thomas's. But there was nothing there, no joy, no relief, no recognition. Just an empty stare, like he was seeing Thomas from a distance, like he wasn't really there at all. "Jason," Thomas repeated, his voice desperate now, barely more than a breath. "What happened to you? Where have you been?" The boy didn't speak. He didn't move, didn't react. He simply stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes still fixed on Thomas, but distant. It was like he didn't even know who he was anymore. Thomas took a step closer, reaching out again. "Come here, son," he said softly, his voice cracking. "It's okay. You're safe now." But the boy flinched, his body jerking back slightly, as if Thomas's presence frightened him. Thomas froze, his hands still outstretched, his mind reeling. What was happening? Where was the boy he knew? What had happened to Jason out there in the wilderness? Without warning, the boy turned and started walking away, his pace slow but purposeful, as if drawn by some invisible force. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't let him go, not again. Not after everything that had happened. He reached out and grabbed the boy's shoulder. "Jason, wait." Thomas's voice was louder this time, his panic surging. The boy didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. His face remained empty, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as though Thomas didn't exist. It was as if he was a ghost, a hollow shell of the child Thomas had known. The terror that gripped Thomas's chest was all-consuming. He pulled the boy back, spinning him to face him. "Jason, please. Tell me what happened. Where have you been? Why you like this?" His voice was trembling with emotion now, pleading, desperate for answers. The boy's lips parted, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Thomas thought he might speak, that he would finally hear his son's voice again. But instead, the boy's mouth barely moved, his voice nothing more than a raspy whisper, as if it came from far away. The words hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. His grip on the boy's shoulders tightened, his heart hammering in his chest. What did that mean? What was he trying to say? "Don't go where, Jason?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, trying to understand why his son was acting like this. But the boy didn't respond. He just stared at Thomas, his expression blank, before slowly turning away again and walking deeper into the forest. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though each one was weighted with an unseen burden. Thomas stood frozen, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. What was going on? Where had Jason been? What was happening to him? Without thinking, Thomas followed the boy, his legs moving on their own, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He couldn't lose him again. He couldn't let go of this small thread of hope. But as he moved deeper into the woods, the air grew colder. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches reaching out like twisted hands, and the fog grew thicker, swallowing the path ahead. Every step felt heavier, as though the very forest itself was conspiring to keep him away from the truth. The boy's figure was still visible ahead, but it was growing fainter, the mist obscuring his outline, his movements becoming more erratic. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he picked up the pace, desperate to catch up. "Jason, wait," he shouted, his voice echoing in the silent woods. But the boy didn't stop. As Thomas moved closer, he could see the outline of the boy more clearly now. His heart leapt in his chest when he realized what he was seeing. Jason was standing by the edge of another cliff, staring down at the rocky drop below. Thomas's mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to run. But his feet didn't obey. He was too close now. He reached out again, grabbing the boy's arm. "No, Jason, don't," he yelled, but the boy didn't flinch. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the void below. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, with a sudden, horrifying realization, Thomas understood. The boy wasn't lost. He wasn't even Jason anymore. He had become something else, something dark, something unreachable. And Thomas was powerless to stop it. Thomas stood frozen, his heart thumping loudly in his ears. The boy, no, the figure before him, was staring out into the abyss, his small frame outlined by the fading light. For a long moment, Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't move. He was paralyzed, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The boy before him wasn't Jason. Not anymore. Jason had been lost. This was something else. Jason, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. Please, please look at me. The boy didn't respond. He didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge Thomas's presence in the slightest. His body remained rigid, his eyes fixed on the deep, dark ravine that stretched out beneath them. Thomas took a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling. He reached out, slowly, cautiously, as if any sudden movement might make this eerie moment shatter into something worse. Jason, you're scaring me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's happened to you, but we need to go home. He's fit to me. Tell me what's going on. There was no reaction. Not even a hint of recognition. The boy's face remained expressionless, his eyes wide and empty, as though he was staring into the void itself. Thomas's breath hitched in his throat, his chest tightening. This wasn't his son. It couldn't be. Jason had always been full of life, always had that spark in his eyes. But this boy, this stranger, was different. Cold, silent. Jason, Thomas whispered again, stepping closer, his voice shaking with desperation. Where have you been? Why won't you speak to me? Why won't you tell me what happened? Still, no response. Thomas reached out again, grabbing the boy's arm, trying to pull him back from the cliff's edge. His hands were icy cold, like the boy's skin was made of stone. He jerked, but the boy didn't move. It was as though the child was a statue, locked in place by some invisible force. Panic began to swell in Thomas's chest, threatening to suffocate him. Jason, please, he cried out, shaking the boy's arm harder now. Come on, you're scaring me. Just say something. Finally, the boy's head turned slightly, his vacant eyes meeting Thomas's. For a brief, terrifying second, Thomas thought he saw something flicker in those eyes. A shadow, a hint of recognition. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same hollow emptiness that had consumed the boy from the moment he had appeared. The boy's mouth parted, and for a fleeting moment, Thomas thought he might hear the words he so desperately needed to hear. But instead, the boy muttered something inaudible, his voice barely more than a rasp. Don't leave me. The words sent a chill through Thomas's bones. What? He whispered, barely believing his own ears. The boy's lips trembled as he repeated the phrase. Don't leave me. Thomas's heart twisted painfully in his chest. The words were barely more than a whisper, but they carried an unbearable weight. The boy wasn't just lost, he was begging for something. But what was he trying to say? Why wouldn't he speak more clearly? Thomas's grip tightened around the boy's arm, but the child didn't budge. Jason, I'm here. I won't leave you. Please talk to me. Tell me what happened to you. What's going on? The boy just stared at him, his eyes wide and vacant, his body trembling slightly as if caught in some invisible tremor. There was nothing in his expression, no emotion, no recognition, just that haunting emptiness. Thomas's stomach churned, the realization finally sinking in. This wasn't his son. Jason had been swallowed up by something that left him like this, like a hollow shell of the child he had once been. Thomas felt the sharp sting of tears in his eyes. I don't know what to do, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please come back to me, Jason. Please don't leave me in this nightmare. For a long moment, the boy stood motionless, his head slightly tilted as if listening for something. The sound of the wind swirled around them, the trees creaking under the weight of the cold air. And then, as if on cue, the boy's body suddenly shifted. He moved, just slightly, but the movement was enough to make Thomas recoil in shock. The boy took a step back from the edge, slowly, almost mechanically. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like someone who had forgotten how to be human. The air seemed to thicken around them, the world growing colder with each passing second. Not Jason, the boy muttered softly, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. What? His voice cracked. What do you mean? Who are you? The boy's gaze flicked to the side, as if looking past Thomas, as if seeing something else, something Thomas couldn't even begin to comprehend. I'm just a ghost, the boy whispered, the words barely audible. I'm just a shadow. A memory. Thomas staggered backward, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of the boy's words. A ghost? A memory? What was he talking about? This wasn't Jason. But how could it not be? It looked like him, it sounded like him, except it wasn't. The eyes were wrong. The soul behind them was gone. The boy's voice dropped to an eerie whisper. "Don't follow me, please. You'll never find him. He's gone." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Thomas felt the ground beneath him tremble, not from the wind, but from the sinking realization that Jason might never have been coming back. Whatever this was, it wasn't his son. It wasn't his Jason. And it was starting to feel like Thomas wasn't the one who had lost him. Something far darker, far more insidious had taken him. As the boy's form began to fade into the shadows, disappearing into the mist like a fleeting wisp of smoke, Thomas was left standing there, frozen and paralyzed by fear, with only one horrifying truth in his mind. Jason wasn't lost. Jason was gone. Thomas couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, the words echoing in his mind like an unrelenting drumbeat. Jason wasn't lost. Jason was gone. The boy, the figure that had haunted him for days, the one that resembled his son but wasn't, had vanished into the fog. The air felt colder, as if the very world around him had turned hollow, like all the warmth had been drained from it. Thomas stood frozen, his legs numb, his heart pounding in his chest. The trees around him seemed to close in, the branches twisting, the shadows lengthening. "Jason," he whispered again, but there was no response. No answer. Just the thick, suffocating silence of the forest. What had just happened? What was he supposed to do with this? With the knowledge that his son was gone, but this thing, this creature, was standing in his place? He turned, slowly, as if the weight of his own body had become too heavy to bear. His thoughts were a tangle of confusion, desperation, and anger. He didn't understand what was happening. The boy had said it, he was gone. But where had he gone? And why had this thing taken his place? For a long while, Thomas wandered aimlessly through the forest, his feet moving almost of their own accord. His thoughts were jumbled, his heart aching with every step. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand here, lost in his own grief. He needed answers. He needed the truth. By the time he stumbled back to the cabin, the light was fading, the sun swallowed up by the thick blanket of clouds that hung low in the sky. The door creaked open, but Thomas didn't enter. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the empty cabin inside. It had once been a home, a place of warmth and love. Now it felt like a tomb. He needed to get out. He couldn't stay here. Not with the shadows of the past hanging over him, not with the weight of what had happened to Jason pressing down on him, suffocating him. Turning on his heel, he left the cabin behind, walking with no clear destination in mind, his legs carrying him forward despite the exhaustion that gnawed at him. He wasn't sure how long he walked. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. Nothing mattered. And then, as he stumbled down the path, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "Thomas." He froze. It wasn't the boy's voice. It wasn't Jason. It was a voice that he hadn't heard in years, a voice that he would never have expected to hear again. His stomach twisted in disbelief as the figure stepped out of the shadows, tall, imposing, with that unmistakable sense of power that Thomas had long since come to recognize. It was him. Trump. Thomas's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in confusion and disbelief. Why was Trump here? What was he doing in this remote part of the world? What could he possibly want? Trump's expression was unreadable as he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Thomas. There was a coldness in his gaze, something calculating, something that made Thomas's skin crawl. "I'm sorry," Trump said, his voice smooth and detached. "But I think it's time we have a conversation." Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. His knees felt weak, his legs threatening to buckle beneath him. "What are you doing here?" he managed to ask, his voice raw with emotion. Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes scanning Thomas as if he were inspecting a piece of property. The chill in the air seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in around them. "I know what happened to your son," Trump said, his words cutting through the air with unnerving precision. "And I know you've been searching for answers." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled, his heart pounding. "You know what happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Trump gave a small, almost pitying smile. "You're not the only one who's been looking for him, Thomas." The words hung in the air like a threat. Thomas's mind scrambled for understanding, his thoughts swirling as he tried to piece everything together. What was Trump talking about? How could he know anything about Jason's disappearance? "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the question escaping him before he could stop it. "Why are you here?" Trump's expression darkened. He stepped closer still, his presence overwhelming, like a dark cloud descending on the small clearing. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice cold, almost mocking. "I've been watching everything." Thomas's stomach churned, the feeling of dread growing heavier with each passing second. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, stepping back as if instinctively trying to create distance. "I want you to understand," Trump said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Your son wasn't just lost. He was taken. And you're too blind to see it. You're not looking in the right places, Thomas. You never were." Thomas's chest tightened. The words felt like daggers, cutting deep. His mind was reeling. Taken? Taken by who? By what? "I've been in this game long enough to know how things work," Trump continued, his tone flat and unemotional. "I know how to find things. And your son, Thomas, he's not just a missing child. He's part of something much bigger than you understand." Thomas's heart stopped. He could barely process the words. Something bigger? What was Trump talking about? How did he know all this? Why was he here, now, at this moment? "You're involved in something you don't even realize," Trump added, his gaze narrowing. "And I'm the one who can help you find your son. But you have to accept the truth first." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. How could Trump help him? This was the man who had always been a symbol of power, of control, of something far beyond the reaches of ordinary people like Thomas. How could he be involved in this? What truth? Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse. Trump leaned in closer, his face now only inches from Thomas's. "That your son's fate was sealed long before you even knew it. And the people behind it? They're far more dangerous than you can imagine." Thomas's head spun, the weight of Trump's words settling on him like a heavy burden. Nothing made sense. Everything he thought he knew was falling apart. What did Trump know that Thomas didn't? And more importantly, who was behind it all? Before Thomas could speak, Trump's gaze hardened. "You don't have much time," he said, his voice cold. "The longer you wait, the more they'll take from you." Then, without another word, Trump turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving Thomas standing there, shaken and alone, consumed by a wave of uncertainty and fear. Everything had just changed. And now, Thomas didn't know who to trust, who to believe, or where to turn. Thomas stood frozen in the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest, the air thick with tension. The words Trump had spoken lingered in his mind like a poison, each one more suffocating than the last. "Your son's fate was sealed long before you even knew it." The truth? What truth? Thomas's mind raced, but no matter how many times he asked the question, there was no answer, just the oppressive silence of the forest. He had to find out more. He had to understand. The boy who had come back wasn't Jason. That much was clear now. But what had happened to him? Why had he returned so wrong? And why did Trump, of all people, know something about it? Thomas's feet moved on their own as he walked back toward the cabin, the fog swirling around him, the world feeling increasingly distant, like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare. He needed to know the truth, whatever it was. He couldn't live like this, stuck in this endless loop of uncertainty and fear. As he approached the cabin, something in the distance caught his eye. A shadow, moving quickly, darting between the trees. For a moment, he thought it was just the mist playing tricks on him, but then he saw it again. The silhouette of a person, just beyond the clearing. Someone watching him. His heart skipped a beat. Was it Trump again? Or someone else? Someone who knew more than they were letting on? Without thinking, Thomas followed the shadow, his footsteps quick and deliberate. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't let this moment slip away. Whoever this person was, they knew something. They had to. The figure moved deeper into the woods, weaving through the trees with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. Thomas pushed forward, determined to catch up. He was close now, closer than he'd ever been. He could feel it in his bones. And then, just as he was about to close the distance, the figure turned sharply and disappeared into a small clearing, vanishing into the thickening fog. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. This was it. He had to confront whoever this was. There were no more questions. No more waiting. He had to know. As he entered the clearing, the figure finally came into full view. It was a woman, tall, with sharp features and a presence that felt almost too controlled, too deliberate. She stood in the center of the clearing, her back to Thomas, her posture straight and confident. She was waiting for him. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice hoarse and desperate. He couldn't shake the feeling that this woman knew more than she was letting on. The woman didn't answer at first. She simply turned, her eyes meeting his with a cool, calculating gaze. "Thomas," she said, her voice smooth, almost disinterested. "You've been looking for answers?" Thomas stepped forward, his hands trembling. "I need to know what happened to my son. What happened to Jason?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Your son," she trailed off as if considering the words carefully. "Jason was never meant to be found. Not by you." The words hit Thomas like a slap. "What are you talking about? Where is he? What have you done to him?" The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, there was something dangerous in her gaze. Something cold, something calculating. "We didn't do anything to him. Your son was never meant to be saved." Her words were chilling, like a blade slicing through the air. Thomas shook his head, his heart racing. This couldn't be happening. "What do you mean? Why are you doing this? Why is my son? She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Your son was part of a bigger plan. He was never just a child, Thomas. He was chosen. And once he was chosen, there was no going back." "Chosen for what?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper, his throat dry as he tried to comprehend what she was saying. His mind was reeling, his world spinning. The woman's smile faded, and she looked at him with a cold, almost pitying expression. "For the same reason you're here. Because you're a part of something much bigger than you understand. You always have been." Thomas's stomach twisted in disbelief. This was a nightmare. He wasn't supposed to be a part of this. This wasn't his life. He wasn't supposed to be caught up in some larger, twisted plan. He stepped back, his mind racing. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just want my son back. I want Jason back. You don't get it, do you?" The woman's voice had an edge now, something sharper, colder. "Your son is gone. And he's never coming back. You've been chasing shadows this whole time, Thomas." The finality in her voice sent a shiver down his spine. Jason wasn't coming back. That was it. He was gone. "I can't," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't accept that. I can't." "You don't have a choice," the woman interrupted, her tone now cold and final. "You've already lost. And now, you'll have to live with the consequences." Her words hung in the air, suffocating him, crushing him beneath their weight. She was right, wasn't she? He had already lost. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, had been ripped away from him. There was no coming back from this. The woman turned and began to walk away, her figure disappearing into the fog, leaving Thomas standing there alone. The world around him felt hollow, the trees looming like dark sentinels in the distance. He had no answers. No hope. Just an empty, endless void. For the first time since Jason's fall, Thomas finally understood. The boy he had been searching for wasn't lost. He had been taken, and there was nothing he could do to bring him back. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, the finality of her words like a death sentence. "You've already lost." And as the fog closed in around him, Thomas realized that she was right. The truth was far darker than he had ever imagined, and he had already become part of it. There was no going back. The woman had vanished into the mist, leaving him alone with the crushing truth. Jason was never coming back. The boy he had tried so desperately to save, the son he had loved, was lost forever, swept away by forces beyond his understanding. Thomas sank to his knees, the world spinning around him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All that was left was the ache in his chest, the empty, gnawing void where his son used to be. He had failed him. He had failed as a father. And now, there was nothing left but grief. But just as he was about to collapse under the weight of it all, a sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. A rustling sound, faint at first, but growing louder, coming from deeper in the woods. It was a sound Thomas recognized, footsteps. And they were coming closer. His heart raced as he struggled to stand, the exhaustion in his bones almost too much to bear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the fog. A man, tall, familiar, but not someone Thomas had seen in years. It was Mark, the police officer, the one who had warned him about the town's growing whispers, the one who had urged him to get help. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "Mark," he said, his voice shaky, unsure if he was hallucinating or if this was real. Mark stopped just a few feet away from him, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Mark said softly, his voice low and regretful. "I didn't want you to find out this way. But it's time you knew the truth." Thomas stared at him, confusion swirling in his mind. "What are you talking about?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. "What truth?" Mark took a deep breath, glancing around the empty clearing before finally locking eyes with Thomas. "You've been part of something much bigger than you realize, Thomas. Something far darker. I tried to protect you, but it's too late now. The forces at work here, they never wanted you to find Jason. They never wanted you to get close." Thomas's mind reeled, his chest tightening. "What are you saying? What did you do to him? What did you do to my son?" Mark hesitated, his eyes flicking to the ground. "I couldn't stop it. None of us could. The people who took Jason, who took him away, they were always a step ahead. And now it's your turn. Why?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper, his knees trembling beneath him. "Why did you let this happen?" Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his face inches from Thomas's. "Because I had no choice. We all have our roles to play. But now, it's your turn to decide. The truth is, Thomas, you're not just a victim in all this. You're part of the reason this happened." Thomas shook his head, the words too much to bear. He had been a father. He had been a man of honor, a man of duty. But in this twisted world, none of that mattered. He had been manipulated, used as a pawn, and now it was too late to change anything. Mark's expression softened slightly, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Thomas, but it's time to let go. Jason is gone. And now you have to face what comes next." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His mind screamed in protest, but his body, his soul, felt exhausted. The fight had left him. There was nothing left but a hollow, empty ache where his son used to be. The fog swirled around them, thick and suffocating. And as Thomas looked at Mark one last time, he realized with a terrible clarity that the truth wasn't something he could escape. He had already lost. And no matter what he did, the game was over. Jason was gone. And the world he had once known had crumbled away. Mark turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving Thomas alone with nothing but the darkening forest and the echoes of a life that was now beyond his reach.